Hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen, kids of all ages. My name is Avi, and welcome to episode 3 of Gregtech New Horizons. Here we are, starting off our third episode with construction of a Tinker's Construct hammer. Last episode we finished up making the tool forge, and now we're working on making the stuff that we can make with the tool forge, the new tools. Namely, starting off with the hammer. The reason why I want the hammer is because it allows for 3x3 mining, and that will expedite our ore collection process nearly tenfold. Well, ninefold, but still. With the hammer made, I go looking for a very specific enhancement to put on my hammer, or actually on my pickaxe, and that is the fire crystal. You see, because of the luck modifier that is already applied to the tools, and because the tools now drop in ores, I started considering the idea of using a fire crystal, because that will auto-smelt it, and that can speed things up. Now, the crafting recipe for Fire Crystal takes Thaumcraft, but we do get it as a quest reward from the Nether quest line, from the Nether quest. So, this is what I start working towards. I would already need to get the Nether, so this really just pushes me towards doing it. I craft the flint and steel, which is a relatively simple crafting recipe, and dig out the space for the Nether portal. And then I realize I don't have fire tick on. And I have to restart the server before actually being able to enter the Nether. The spawn we get in the Nether is fine. I'd prefer something a little bit better, but we spawn next to a quartz vein, which isn't terrible. And I would end up spending a lot of time in here eventually, but that's for later. Now all the faffing around I do for the lava crystals, actually for naught, because I didn't realize that it didn't apply to Gregtech ores at all. I have a big dilemma about what to apply it to, but ultimately it's irrelevant because this is just kind of a useless modifier. With the new useless lava crystal intact on my pickaxe, I decide to get cursing out into the lazurite and the balsatic mineral sand veins for some more gypsum and calcite to make my second bricked blast furnace. I will end up making 4 of these, but the second one doubles the speed, so it's the most important one to make right now. I also make an excavator and a lumber axe as well. These are the other tools you can make with the tool forge that are very nice to have, to put it lightly. One does 3x3 digging, and one just chops down full trees. And with the new excavator, I end up working my way towards making a proper area later for electricity. And that is time for a montage, isn't it? I also end up upgrading all my tools to steel while working on this. This is just a good thing to do. I also make the Maddock. Steel tools are going to be more expensive to repair, but they're going to be more worth it in the long run. I ultimately don't end up using this longsword because now that I have steel, I can just repair the pan instead that I have, but whatever. Afterwards, I start eyeing up a new quest tab. When I'm looking at the stuff to make my second brick blast furnace, I start seeing the mass production quest tab. When I last played Gregtech New Horizons, this was not one of the tabs, and these steam machines are completely new to 2.7, so I was excited to use them. Unfortunately, we won't be using most of them, at least none of the new ones, because I ultimately see them as pretty pointless. I don't need a really advanced mixer or a really advanced forge hammer. However, we will end up making one of the machines, and we'll see which one I'm going to be making afterwards. I like these new steam machines, but they really aren't that useful in the grand scheme of things, because the LV machines are just better and less expensive overall. However, the one steam machine that will be used is the steam macerator, because the parallel maceration is amazing. And that is the reason why we'll be using the steam grinder. Lusting for steam machines aside, we start putting our focus towards making the actual fire bricks for the brick blast furnace. This is literally just the same thing that we did before, except again. So it's not anything terribly interesting. Gregtech machines can end up sharing sides, so we actually need less fire bricks for our second brick blast furnace than we need for our first one. This becomes more interesting when we have IO hatches coming in later, where machines can share input-output hatches. But for right now, it's not really important because there isn't any hatches on the brick blast furnace. There's just the face block. I also end up misplacing these blocks, so I had to fix that. And just like that, steel is being made twice as quickly. It's a very nice improvement. My next creation is the charcoal pile ignitor, which is kind of ridiculous for how easy it is to craft, or how simple it is to craft, rather. It can generate, with the correct setup, about 1 charcoal per second. But it's not really something that's automatable, so it's good for the early to mid game, where you want a lot of charcoal, but you don't need to automate it. In this case, basically whenever I am doing something else, imagine this thing is probably running. I need a lot of charcoal for things like my boilers and stuff, so this is a very necessary thing to have, but will be replaced, just not for a while. 1 charcoal per second is insane. Anyways, then I get to nether mining. I'm not going to talk about my difficulties I had with nether mining, because I had a lot of them. But I do end up finding the necessary veins that I need. That is to say, a tetrahedrite vein, which is stibnite, later used for antimony, and a sulfur vein, which took me quite a while to find, and I was trying to find it in a very stupid way before, but whatever. My method for nether mining wasn't the greatest to start with, and it took a while for it to improve. But once I found the sulfur vein, it was straight to digging it out. I end up needing sulfur for my electronic components that are coming down later down the line as I start preparing for low voltage. After all the resource collection, I start properly eyeing the steam grinder as my next goal to make. The recipe is a lot of bronze, but other than that, there's nothing that's super expensive in it. There's a little bit of gold that's required for the tumbuga, but that's about it. At this point I already had the grinder main box done, and it was just working on all the bronze casings around it and the steam hatch for it, which I got as well. The ultra low voltage fluid tank is a not expensive craft even in the slightest. And I'm probably going to be making a few more of those in the next episode because they are very, very nice for fluid storage for how cheap they are to craft. I end up being a very silly little dummy and forgetting to record the part where I craft the input and output hatch for the steam grinder. Regardless, those aren't difficult to craft either, and I start setting it up in my basement. The real thing that makes the steam grinder so useful is that it processes maceration recipes at the same speed as the macerator, but it processes it at 8 at a time. So effectively, it's 8 times faster, which is very, very good, obviously. Especially for things like ores, where macerating them is amazing. It's great. Ore doubling is obviously a good thing, but the macerator is so slow that it just becomes a waste of time to do it, except for very special ores. But with the steam grinder being able to process it 8 at a time, it becomes a viable option for ore processing. In fact, this used to be the only steam machine that there was, the only steam multi-block, but that has definitely changed. It didn't even have a quest before, so I'm glad that it has one now because this is an absolutely lovely machine. And it works like a charm. With our new fancy macerator made, I start getting work on getting the components for the next 2 brick blast furnaces, which again will come cheaper now that we have the 2 brick blast furnaces already set up beforehand. There's nothing new to any of the recipes. It's the same process done before, and it'll be the same process done again. It's just that, you know, I need to make the components for the 40 more fire bricks that I need to make. It's cheap enough at this point. Now that I have the big macerator, it makes all the maceration parts for it go by much faster. And getting components for the fire bricks is easy. And then I finished digging out the area for the next blast furnaces. Again, because they can share sides, the back walls of the previous blast furnaces can be used as the back walls for these ones as well. With 4 of them, this now makes about 1 steel per minute if I have them running constantly, which is not terribly fast, but it is perfectly sufficient for what we need, which is not necessarily a lot of steel, but just a good amount to start low voltage. Speaking of starting low voltage, throughout this time, I had placed down some rubber trees nearby to my place and had been occasionally tapping them for some sticky resin. This is because I end up needing sticky resin in order to get raw rubber dust to then make rubber ingots, which we're going to need, obviously, for rubber. Rubber ingots take raw rubber dust, which we get by extracting the sticky resin, and they also take sulfur, which, well, we got that previously. We're going to need a lot of rubber for low voltage, and basically whenever possible, I'm working on that rubber. Start looking towards making high pressure boiler casings, which produce more steam per water when they're heated up. For that, I also start looking towards making molds, which requires the smeltery in order to make them. in the process of getting lava for the smeltery, I end up getting my, what, fourth? No, third death of the series. And then I also end up getting my fourth death of the series. Ultimately, I need all this stuff to make the molds, of which I need 5 of them for later progression. I also finish up the rubber quest, which is useful. Rubber is something that we're going to end up going through a lot of before getting properly into LV. So I'm going to be having the alloy smelter run constantly with resin and sulfur. I get the high pressure casings, and what I end up needing these for is I'm going to be making a secondary boiler firebox for my future LV area. I'm probably going to end up expanding this boiler firebox later, but for right now, I'm basically just getting the preparations for the steam generation in my LV area. I also start working on making the wires that are required for another quest. These are most of the wires that we're going to need for the first set of circuits for the first turbine, which is what I'm working towards right now, making all the necessary ingredients in order to make the first steam turbine, and thus, technically, our first LV machine. The first tier of electronic circuits are not terribly difficult to craft, though they do take a ridiculous amount of copper, especially at this point in the game where we don't have more efficient ways of processing. Although ultimately the electronic circuits are just a bunch of microcrafting. Resistors, code circuit boards, vacuum tubes, they're all just intermediate. Speaking of intermediates, here we're making electronic motors, which is probably the most necessary LV intermediate, and we'll be making a lot of these in due time. Right now, they're still pretty expensive, and we only need 2 of them, so that's all we end up making. Though later we'll be making stacks of them at a time. I finished making all the molds that are required for LV and start working towards the vacuum tubes. Now that we have the ball mold, we can start making the glass tubes and then the vacuum tubes with it. First, though, I get work on the machine casing, which is also required for the turbine. Which I should add is indeed our current point of progression. We're working on making the steam turbine so we can start LV power. Here we make our vacuum tubes, and with that, we have effectively all the components we need in order to make our electronic circuit. The coated circuit board isn't anything too troubling. It's just wood and resin. And it ends up needing to be further surrounded in copper wires, which I do end up forgetting some of the copper wires, but that's fine. I have enough of the copper and spare. So I just end up making more of them. We're going to be needing a lot of these circuits eventually, though right now they're a little too expensive to really craft in batch. I also end up forgetting the steel casing for this, but I have plenty of steel. At this point, I had about 4 stacks of steel, and I want to keep about that many stacks of steel as well. So, with the steel casing, that is our first electronic circuit. The last of the crafting components for the basic steam turbine aren't terribly difficult to get to. It is just the tin rotors at this point, which themselves is just tin. It's just a bit of tin, which you can get in plentiful amounts. So with the tin rotors made, That means that we can make the basic steam turbine, thus our first proper LV machine. Now, this now having just a turbine and nothing to power it with isn't like the greatest thing because well, we can make electricity, but we don't really have anything to use that electricity on. But there are many, many, many options to make for our first LV machine. But there is exactly one that is on my mind. Regardless, having a steam turbine is a great start. The first machine I end up planning on making is the wire pile, but we're not going to quite get to that yet. After updating to 2.7.1, the recipes kind of fix themselves, and now I'm able to actually get to what I wanted to do for a little bit of time, and that's cooking for blockheads. Well, cooking for blockheads when backported. You see, there's this thing called Spice of Life in the pack, and the thing about Spice of Life in this pack is that for each 20 different foods you eat, you gain an extra heart. That's how I end up having about 23 hearts. I've eaten so much food that it just is my natural heart amount. Cooking for blockheads expedites the process of attempting to eat all of the foods. Now, with the patch that I was playing on beforehand, cooking for blockheads was actually broken. Or, more correctly, the stone plates were broken, where I wasn't getting the correct type of stone plate. But now that I updated, it's the correct version that will allow me to actually be able to make the cooking for blockheads machines, which I like quite a lot, and will expedite cooking. So basically just imagine that whenever I have time, I'm going to just be making some random cooking items from Cooking for Blockheads, just to try and get myself more hearts. With that side quest fulfilled, it is time to get towards making another machine, and in this case, our next machine is going to be the LV wire mill. Starting off by making the electronic circuits for it, and then we end up making the 4 electric motors required for it. The reason why we want the LV wire mill is because it triples our wire production, which is insanely useful because wires are used in just about every recipe going forward. They're used plentifully in machines, in motors, in circuits, in everything. So having something that allows us to make wires both faster and more efficiently is an insanely useful upgrade. And in basically every Gregtech pack, the wire mill is always the first machine to make because it's just that useful. Now that we're getting into LV properly, we're going to need to start storing steam for LV properly. I'm bifurcating my electric setup from my steam setup, mostly just because I'm going to eventually retire the steam setup, so it's good to move it away now. And also this tank is later going to become a steel multi-block tank instead of an iron one, which holds 2 times as much, as many buckets per block. I hook up the water tank to the boiler multi-block, and that's our steam generation, pretty much set up for a decent amount of LV until quite a bit later. With steam production and steam storage for low voltage now situated, it's time for electricity. Now, my beginner low voltage setup is going to be extremely simple. It is just going to be 1x tin cables, or it's just going to be tin cables right at the moment. No, it's not even going to be cables, it's just right next to the turbine. Either way, eventually we'll get more into the complicated bits and pieces of Gregtech power. I know my way around it, but right now all you need to know is that turbine generates 32 EU per tick, and this recipe only takes 4, so we are perfectly satisfied to get our first copper wires directly from a wire mill. So what's the next move after more efficient wires? Well, it'd be working towards more efficient plates. The basic bending machine is the next goal of mine, which allows us to turn one ingot into one plate directly. This is a not as necessary an upgrade as the wire mill, but it is still a very valuable upgrade. It's one of the nice quality of life improvements that low voltage unlocks. And it's a relatively simple craft, but we do need to make a new component for it. Well, we were originally just making a bunch of LV motors. For the bending machine, we have to make electric pistons, which is just more steel. It's not a terribly complicated recipe. But with that, oh, and the electronic circuits, that is going to end up being the bending machine. And that really stills us up for making LV machines much more efficiently, since now we don't have to really beholden ourselves to the inefficiencies that lie within the steam machines. That is the bending machine. I also decided to realign the placement of some of the electric machines, just for them to be more easily expanded upon later with only one turbine. One thing that I have not mentioned as I have been making these machines is how horribly expensive some of the parts to it are. Because I've been able to skip through most of the boring microcrafting, it really doesn't convey the fact that these machines are still decently expensive to craft. While the steel and the iron and redstone come relatively cheaply, and the tin and the copper are easy, the rubber has become a problem. The rubber is being made too slowly and too inefficiently. So the next goal is to fix that up. However, that's not as simple of a process as it was for the wires and the plates. Instead, we're going to need ourselves two, and in some ways, three machines in order to really properly get into rubber production. This needs the chemical reactor, the fluid solidifier, and the centrifuge. The three of them altogether are what I'm going to be next crafting, but at the moment, I realize I really don't need the centrifuge for what I'm doing. I just need the chemical reactor and the fluid solidifier. The chemical reactor is able to make rubber 9 times more efficiently. And after a little bit of the microcrafting, we get both the chemical reactor and, after making the electric pumps, the fluid solidifier. What the chemical reactor does is it turns raw rubber pulp, which we were getting previously from the extraction of sticky resin. It combines raw resin and sulfur to get liquid rubber. And then with a fluid solidifier, we can turn that liquid rubber directly into rubber sheets at a 144 millibucket or a 1 ingot to 1 sheet ratio. This is extremely ideal. We are able to, the ratios aren't exact, but what is for sure is that we're making a lot more rubber, a lot more cheaply using a chemical reactor now. Now, I mentioned it before, so the obvious question is, what would we need the centrifuge for? The centrifuge took a lot of electronic circuits, so I didn't make it at the moment. The centrifuge functions the same as the steam extractor in terms of what we use it for, which is turning sticky resin into raw rubber pulp. However, it produces an extra byproduct, that being in refined glue. Refined glue is pretty useful for a lot of different applications for various electronic components. This includes things like more efficient recipes for resistors, more efficient recipes for coded circuit boards, more efficient recipes for a number of different crafts. So that's why I wanted the centrifuge, not only so I didn't need to use the steam extractor anymore, but also so I could get refined glue and use that for its multitude of extremely useful purposes. And with those 5 LV machines, we basically have free reign to go for just about any LV machine we want. We've gotten a very efficient way of making many of the components that are required in large amounts for low voltage machines. So the next machine we're making is potentially the most useful machine in all of Gregtech, the assembling machine. It is also pretty expensive, and I'm going to be making a lot of circuits along with it too, for a reason that will soon become evident. For this, we need 8 electronic circuits. And then we need the 2 robot arms and the 2 LV conveyor belts required for the assembling machine as well. While I do have all the components, it is a very expensive crafting tree. However, fortunately, we have the power of video editing in order to skip all of the micro crafting. Man, isn't Gregtech so easy to play? With an assembling machine made, what's the first thing we'll make in it? Well, we'll combine a diamond and 4 electronic circuits to get something. There's one thing left I want to accomplish in this video, and that requires us to do a little bit more dimension traveling, like we did just a few minutes before. And that takes a quick and dirty portal generator. And then I realized that I didn't actually have the prerequisite quest requirements, so I had to go find a silverwood tree and tear it up for its sapling. These Thaumcraft trees, especially the silverwood ones, aren't terribly common. This one also spawned next to 2 eldritch obelisks, which surely can't be too ominous, right? Either way, I tore down the tree and that got the quest requirements. We're going to the Twilight Forest, baby. Now, while the Twilight Forest is opened up, that really just means that we need to start gearing up better. The Pan of Doom is nice, but I want a little bit more for my next plan. So, I start armoring up. I get myself a wooden crossbow, get some bolts along with it, and I also end up making iron armor, which I've kind of been delaying for a while. Oh, and the iron shield, obviously, because the Mind of Balagir shields are so useful. I replaced my current armor with iron armor, mostly just because I like uniformity. So that's why I went with all iron. Though I think it would also just have been better for me to go all iron, so not like I even lost anything doing it. And then I start heading down to a Naga arena that I marked on the map. The Twilight Forest has a lot of very useful things, but right now I was feeling a little bit aggressive after all of the crafting that I had done, so I was instead going to take it out on this big fat snake living in a labyrinth. It's a form of stress relief. My therapist recommends it. The Naga arena wasn't too far away. Well, it was about 300 blocks away. Though I did feel like my iron armor was slowing me down. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but with the Naga arena found, let's go in and let's tear that snake apart. that's one way for him to go, I guess. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. I got the Naga scales anyway. I win. Haha. If I want to kill him again, well, there's plenty more around there. But, yay! Confusing victories aside, that will be the end of this episode. We're going to be doing more mining in the Twilight Forest eventually, but that is going to be all for today. I thank you all for watching, and I thank you all for waiting for this episode. I know it took a long while to come out, but I hope you all enjoyed. See you all another time. Bye-bye.